Today, we're going to be looking at some of the biggest losses in the UFC in 2024. I've compiled about 12 different high-profile fights. We're going to be ranking them on 3 categories to decide which loss was the worst so far of 2024. The 3 different categories we have are physically, how bad did they look after the fight? Career, how much did it affect their overall career? And embarrassment, how bad were they dominated / viral clips was made of them, all that sort of stuff. This gives us a total score out of 30. Whoever has the highest score out of 30 at the end walks away with the trophy for the biggest loser. All right, let's get right into it. The very first fight that we have to rank is Max Holloway losing to Ilia Topuria, the most recent fight at UFC 308. Dylan, let's hear your rankings.
So for Max Holloway, physically, I had it at a 4 out of 10. Like, Max Holloway doesn't really show damage. I think it's just because he has such like a thin face. You know, he's not getting cut up and busted up. I did give him a 4. For his career, I gave him a 6, just because it was like kind of like the end of his time in featherweight. He's never going to get back to that featherweight gold, but he has new opportunities in lightweight. And then for embarrassment, I went 3 out of 10. These guys put on a war. We knew that someone was going to have to come out on top. I don't think it was really embarrassing for Holloway at all. So my total score for Max Holloway losing to Ilia Topuria at 308, 13 out of 30.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I think we're going to have a very different opinion on a lot of these fights. So this is going to be interesting. For my rankings, physically, I gave him a 6 out of 10 because taking into the factor of a knockout. If you get knocked out, especially because it's his first time, he looked bad at the press conference afterwards. His voice was all messed up. So I gave him a 6 out of 10. Again, he doesn't really show damage, so you can't really rate him that high. For the second ranking, career-wise, I only gave him a 5 out of 10 because yes, it is probably his last chance at getting featherweight gold, but he does have a massive career opportunity at lightweight. So honestly, it didn't affect him like that much. And then for my final ranking of embarrassment, I gave him a 7 out of 10.
Ooh, that's high.
I know it is high because it's his first time getting knocked out. And I think the clips that Ilia put out beforehand in their pre-fight interviews and all that sort of stuff, it made a bigger buildup than most of Max Holloway's fights, and getting knocked out. Yeah.
I think it's a little high. It's a little high.
So my total score was 18 out of 30.
All right, moving on to our next fight. BSD versus Renato Moicano at UFC Paris. Lucas, what's your scoring on this one?
So my first score for physically, how bad did they look? It is a 10 out of 10. This dude, it's one of the worst cuts and first rounds I've ever seen. Secondly, career, how bad did it affect their career? I think this dude is being found out as a little bit of a fraud, so I gave him an 8 of 10 for it affecting his career. This probably should have put him outside of the rankings, so I think this actually did affect his career quite a bit. And then lastly, embarrassment, how bad were they dominated? / viral clips. I mean, look at his face. He got absolutely destroyed. I went with 8 out of 10 for a total score of 26 out of 30.
I'm very similar to Lucas. I went 10 out of 10 on physically. If it's a doctor stoppage, it has to be 10.
Yeah.
If the doctor to stop the fight physically, you're done. Next up for career, I went 7 out of 10. I do think that it makes us have to reevaluate how good BSD is and if he actually is good or if he's just like tough. You know, being able to stick through it for a long time. He is still relatively young, so he has time to have a little resurgence. And then finally, for embarrassment, I went 8 out of 10 as well, just because he was absolutely dominated. We didn't really see too many viral clips after.
No.
But he was dominated in that fight.
Yeah. So your total score is
25 out of 30.
Okay, so we're pretty similar on that one. Let's move on to O'Malley losing to Merab at UFC 306, UFC Noche. First off, physically, how bad did they look? He didn't really have that many scratches on him, so I went for a 2 out of 10. And then career-wise, I think this did largely affect his career. This was his first loss that wasn't like a weird fluke, right? This was his first legit loss to a contender. And I think that he's going to struggle moving back up the bantamweight ladder. I think this really affects his chances at getting other big fights in the future at featherweight. He was planning on going up fighting Topuria. That's completely off the table now because he's not even a champion in his own division. I went for an 8 out of 10 for career ranking. For embarrassment, the clip of him getting kissed by Merab, it just did so much damage. So I went for a 7 out of 10 for embarrassment for a total score of 17 out of 30.
All right, I'm a little bit lower than Lucas. For physically, I went a 1. You wouldn't even been able to tell that Sean O'Malley fought. The cut did more damage to him than the actual fight itself. Next up for career, I went 6 out of 10. I do think it like really hindered our like preference on Sean O'Malley. You know, he was his champion with one title defense, had beaten Aljo, who was an elite level grappler, comes out here, loses to Merab. Can he even compete against these top grapplers in bantamweight? But he is still young. You know, you have to give him that grace. If he was 35 years old and he lost it, he'd probably be an 8 or a 9. And then finally for embarrassment, I went 6 out of 10. Yeah, he did have that clip where Merab did some weird stuff, but Merab was forcing it too much compared to it being a natural clip. So my overall score, 13 out of 30.
Let's move on to Strickland losing to Duplessis very early on in the year, UFC 297. For first up, physically, I gave this a 4 out of 10. Sean actually did have quite a bit of blood coming from him, but Sean just doesn't really get that much damage in general, so I stuck with a 4. Career-wise, I also went for a 4 out of 10. This is one of those fights where Sean is still right up there in a number 1 contender spot, so I don't think this really affected his career that much. But I do think that the UFC doesn't really love having him as the face of a division just because of how controversial he is. So he might not get gifted shots at the title like we've seen with other people in the middleweight division, Israel Adesanya. And lastly, for the embarrassment factor, I went with a 1 out of 10. He did not get embarrassed at all. It was actually arguably his win. So
True.
Didn't get embarrassed really at all.
I think I'm a little bit tougher on Sean here. First up, for physically, I went 4. There was some damage to Sean, but because of his fighting style, he doesn't really traditionally take that much damage in a fight. Career, I went a 7 out of 10. Just because Sean is getting older. As you get older as a champion, every time you lose, it's like, can he ever get back to that championship? And I really think that his route back to the championship was if Adesanya beat Dricus. I do think Sean is it's gonna be a tough fight, him versus Dricus, if they rematch. I think it's a really 50-50 fight. So I think that really sets back his career a little bit. And now moving on to embarrassment, I went 3 out of 10 just because in terms of like the fight, he didn't really get embarrassed. It was a really close decision, but some of the stuff that happened in the press conference, so there were some clips, and he gets made cry, but then that's not really related to the fight, but it still had to be put in there, you know, because Dricus is a very like meme champion, so there is some things that come from it. So overall, I went with a 14 out of 30.
I completely forgot about those press conference clips. If I would have remembered that, I probably would have rated it a bit higher.
But that's not part of the fight.
That's true. Okay, let's move on to Volk versus Topuria. This was one of the saddest losses of the year at UFC 298. Starting off with my physical score. Physically, he did get battered a little bit, not too badly though, and then it was just that KO at the end, but it was a brutal KO. He was out cold for like a little bit after, so I went for a 7 out of 10. Next up, for career-wise, how much did it affect his career? I also went for a 7 out of 10 because this was his first loss to a featherweight in the UFC. And I think it affected it pretty bad. 2 back-to-back KO losses. We don't know if he's ever going to get back to that championship status. And now it's looking like he's either going to fight Topuria again or maybe Diego Lopez. So I think he still has a chance at getting the belt back, but it's a slim chance at this point. And then lastly, for the embarrassment, I went for a 5 out of 10. I don't really think it was that embarrassing of a fight. He looked competitive in that first round and even in the second round until he get caught, but it was also his first time getting KO'd by a featherweight. So you got to put some respect on it. That is a total of 19 out of 30.
All right, for Volk versus Topuria, physically, I went 7 out of 10. You get knocked out. He was out cold. You kind of have to go with the 7. It's not like he came out being covered in blood, but he still got knocked out cold. Career, I went 8 out of 10 just because it was kind of like, ooh, is it for Volk? Is Volk not the same Volk we used to know? So there was that whole narrative going on after the fight. He'd been knocked out 2 fights in a row. Finally, moving on to embarrassment, I went 7 out of 10 just because I have seen that clip of him getting knocked out a ton. It's a very common clip. It's a clip that hurts a lot of people, but I have seen that clip a lot. So this is giving me a total score of 22 out of 30 for Volk's loss to Topuria.
All right, let's move on to Hill losing to Pereira at UFC 300, one of the most iconic losses this year. I'll start off with my physical score of a 7 out of 10. Again, it's literally the same as Volk versus Topuria. He got KO'd pretty much cold, but he didn't really take that much damage because it was a first round KO. Next up, for career-wise, I think this damaged his career a lot because it really makes you question, is he that good? He got KO'd by Pereira, and then he's making all these excuses and just the fashion of it. So I went for an 8 out of 10 for career. And lastly, embarrassment. This is the most embarrassing loss of 2024 in my opinion. So I had to go for a 10 out of 10 for a total score of 25 out of 30.
I'm very close to you. First up, physically, like you said, very similar to Volk. Got knocked out. He wasn't like a clean knockout, but those ground punches did some damage to Jamahal Hill. There's some CTE going on in there, or maybe he's just delusional. Moving up next to career, I went with a 7 out of 10. I do think that Jamahal Hill's kind of young enough, and like, you know, if Pereira leaves, that division's wide open, but it really showed us that he's a step below Pereira. He might even be 2 steps below Pereira because Pereira is that good. And embarrassment, it's a 10 out of 10. It might have been the easiest ranking on this list, giving him a 10. He has been clowned on social media, and it's not all because of Pereira, it's also because he's a clown, but that clip is viral.
Yeah. And then afterwards,
Yeah.
the whole...
But
dude, the clip of Jamahal Hill when they're facing off, and he's like... it's so bad, dude.
all right, so that's going to give me a final score of 24 to 30 for Jamahal Hill's loss to Poatan Pereira.
All right, let's move on to Poirier losing to Makhachev at UFC 302. Physically, he did get battered a little bit. There's that classic image where his nose is just dripping blood. So he did take a little bit of damage and ended up getting submitted. I went for a 6 out of 10 for physical wise. Career wise, I also went for a 7 out of 10 because it is his last chance, 100% last chance at getting lightweight gold. And he's had to go up against the hardest competition, so I feel bad for him. But at the same time, he's such a massive star that he can still get just huge checks. Like Gaethje fight, Dan Hooker fight, Max Holloway fight. Those are all 3 massive fights, and he's going to retire anyways.
Exactly.
So I didn't think it was like a 8 or a 9. I went with a 7. And then in terms of embarrassment, I went for a 1 out of 10. He did not get embarrassed at all. He's one of those warriors like Khalil Roundtree where you think he's outgunned and then he comes out and lasts 5 rounds. It's incredible. So that gives me a total score of 14 out of 30.
Ooh, we're so close. We haven't gotten the same number yet. So for Poirier, I went 7 out of 10 for physically. He got, I wouldn't say he got destroyed, but he got somewhat dominated, you know. It was a pretty good win from Islam, but credit to Poirier for sticking in there. He had his damage. He had the nosebleed, like you said, which really affected him because he wasn't able to use that hand to pull up his shorts while he was fighting. Next up for career, I went with a 7 out of 10 as well. I think that it was like, yeah, this is Poirier's last shot. He's not going to get back there. But at the same time, it showed that Poirier still has it. Being able to keep up with Islam the way he did, it's like, okay, he can have some awesome fights for his Gaethje. He can rival Max Holloway for the BMF belt. He can outclass Hooker. He's going to have some awesome fights left in his career. And then for embarrassment, I also went with a 1 just because he went out there and he showed that he could keep up with the pound for pound number 1 as he had no hips, as he was getting old. He did not disappoint a single soul that night. So that gives me a final score of 15 out of 30.
Okay, that's fair. Let's move on to Yuri Prochazka versus Alex Pereira, number 2, their second fight. For the first ranking, physically, he got absolutely battered. Prochazka literally just got outclassed in every single exchange in the striking. And then he also got dropped at the beginning of the first round, KO'd instantly by a head kick at the end of the second round. I went for an 8 out of 10 for physically. He didn't really bleed that much, but Prochazka doesn't really bleed, so that's just a fact. Career-wise, I gave this only a 5 out of 10 for Prochazka. I don't know why, but I think it's part of the reason is because he already got KO'd once. So I think I was kind of expecting the same thing going into the second fight. It was short notice.
Someone predicted Pereira.
Okay, shut up.
Someone predicted Prochazka.
Dude, I got to be different sometimes.
Someone predicted Prochazka wearing a Pereira shirt. With a Pereira shirt on, said Prochazka was going to win.
Okay, so I went for a 5 out of 10 because it was short notice. I guess I can't say I expected him to get battered because I literally predicted against him.
Liar.
Okay, let's just move on from that. Embarrassment wise, I went for a 7 out of 10. There was a couple clips of like his samurai little hair thing.
The Poatan stare.
Oh yeah, the magic and him like, yeah, the shamanic magic beforehand. Like, bro, that's like your last line of excuses. This dude's literally using magic against me. So I went for 7 out of 10 for a total score of 20 out of 30.
Ooh, a little generous with Prochazka. All right, physically, I went 8 out of 10. He got pretty much dominated in that fight. He got knocked out basically twice. He got saved by the bell in the first round, and then as we moved into the second round, it was lights out instantly. And like Yuri doesn't show like blood, but that little stupid thing on his head being broken in half. Like, it was like, oh, that's his soul being broken.
Yeah.
Career, I went 8 out of 10 for Yuri, just because it was his second loss to Pereira, and kind of similar to what I said with Jamahal Hill. It's like he's 2 steps below Pereira. Like, Pereira's up here as a champion, and you're not even a contender. You're below contender. You're not there to contend. He's never going to get another shot against Pereira. Gonna have to wait until there's another person there. And it really made Yuri like reconsider a lot of things in his career. He's like, oh, I need like 3 fights before I can fight again for the belt. Go into my cave. And then finally, for embarrassment, I went 8 out of 10. He got pretty destroyed in that fight. And then after the shaman magic staring at him and he just fell.
Aura.
So that gives me a final total of 24 out of 30 for Yuri's loss to Poatan.
All right, I think that's fair. I might have gone a little bit light on that one. Let's move on to Edwards versus Bilal. Obviously, Leon losing in an awful fashion, decisioned by Bilal. It's classic. Physically, I went for a 2 out of 10. He did take a little bit of damage in the striking and the boxing. Bilal's striking actually looked good against Leon Edwards, so I went for a 2 out of 10. He just mainly got laid on for 5 rounds. Career-wise, I went for a 6 out of 10 because it's one of those fights where he is still up there in that number 2 contender spot at welterweight, but at the same time, this could be one of those situations where he loses the belt and then there's a bunch of really difficult competition in that top 5 and he never gets it back. And I think it did expose or just maybe make people rethink his career a little bit. Like, okay, how good was that? How lucky was that first Kamaru Usman head kick? Luck. And then how much damage did Kamaru Usman take? And he wasn't the same fighter. And then that Colby Covington title defense, that's like a Mickey Mouse title defense, like doesn't count. And then gets dominated by Bilal. So I went for a 6 out of 10 for his career. Embarrassment wise, I went for a 9 out of 10. He looked completely awful in that fight. He looked half asleep in most of the grappling exchanges. He got dominated in the boxing by Bilal. And then he also got spiked on his head. It's a 9 out of 10 for a total score of 17 out of 30.
So for my physical score for Leon's loss to Bilal, I went 2 out of 10 too. Like, it wasn't like Sean O'Malley lack of damage. Like, Bilal landed a couple shots to the head, but there was really no significant damage on Leon. He just more so looked sleepy.
Yeah.
Career-wise, I went 7 out of 10. I think it really was like, ooh, like you said, how good was Leon? And it's like, when is Leon going to get his next shot? Because there's so many guys coming up in welterweight right now that it's like these old guys they're just getting passed by. And then for embarrassment, I went 8 out of 10. He got dropped on his head. He got laid on for 25 minutes. Leon looked awful. You would have thought this dude had like, that's made up. You would have thought he had
wait, you can't say that word on YouTube. Retake that line.
You would have thought that Leon had like the flu or something, or that other thing.
That other disease that we can't say.
But yeah, he got dominated. He did not look good. It was like, ugh. Like, it was not like he looked bad at the end of the fight. No, it was the whole 25 minutes. You're sitting there like, what is going on? What am I witnessing right here? This champion looks terrible. So, luckily enough, leaves me with a score of 17 out of 30. We just got there a different way.
That's our same score. First time. That's surprising because I feel like that's like, for a loss as dominant as that, that's pretty low score, but he didn't do any damage for
Exactly.
him. Moving on to Adesanya losing to Duplessis at UFC 305 Perth. This was an interesting one to rank. In terms of damage, Adesanya didn't look damaged, like, at all, pretty much, which is weird because Dricus does hit hard. I went for a 4 out of 10. I think it's pretty middle of the road, but he didn't show any of it. Career-wise, I went for a 7 out of 10 because Adesanya did realistically get gifted this title shot coming off of a couple losses in his career and then a long layoff. And then this is also probably similar to lots of those other champs. They're getting older. It might be his last shot at gold, and now he has to actually face some good contenders. Let's see how he does. So I went for a 7 out of 10 in terms of career. And then lastly, embarrassment, I went for a 6 out of 10. It wasn't that embarrassing, but then again, it's Dricus and he throws punches like he's blindfolded, and then you end up getting submitted after I know he pointed to the ground because he was saying that he slipped, but it also looked like he was doing a Max Holloway and then got submitted right there. So there was some viral clips that led me to a total of 17 again.
All right, so my score for Adesanya's loss to Duplessis. First off, we have physically, I gave him a 5 out of 10. He didn't really take a ton of damage, but I would say if anything, it was his ego that got more so hurt than his actual body. Career, I went 7 out of 10. Like I've said with a lot of these older former champions, it's like, ooh, does he have another shot at the title? Where does he go from here? It's like Adesanya, like, he did not look that great in that fight. It's like, what's he gonna do? Is he just gonna be a feeder for these old guys? Is he gonna just fight super fights now. So it's like, where does this guy go? And then finally for embarrassment, I went 7 out of 10. He got taken to the ground and was submitted in 30 seconds. Not to like Islam, Habib, Shemaev, not to an elite wrestler. To Dricus, who's a good wrestler, but it's not really like his main thing. Like he is a very good submission artist. Like he has a lot of like choke out wins, but Adesanya just didn't look that great. And then you also have to add in the press conference, all that kind of stuff. So that leads me to a total score of 13 out of 30. No, so all of that combined leads me to a total score of 19 out of 30.
Okay, we're pretty similar there. Let's move on to Roundtree versus Pereira at UFC 307 Salt Lake City. First up, physically wise, he got absolutely battered. He looked, I mean, his eyelid was like hanging off. He had like 3 or 4 cuts. I went for a 10 out of 10 in terms of physical. Career wise, I went for a 1 out of 10. I think this is one of those rare cases where you lose, but you actually gain, not aura, but you gain status.
Yeah.
Right? He went 4 rounds with a champion. He went more rounds than Yuri Prohaska, Jamahal Hill combined. I think it was very impressive and a lot of people respect him. He got his name out there a lot more. And then lastly, for embarrassment, it was not that embarrassing, but he just took so much damage. And then Pereira had that ultra instinct in the 4th round where he just was weaving in and out, the head movement. So I went for a 3 out of 10 because he did get a little bit outclassed when Pereira was on antibiotics and blowing his nose in between rounds, for a total of 14 out of 30.
All right, my score for Roundtree. First off, physically, I went 9 out of 10. It wasn't 10 out of 10 because it wasn't a doctor stoppage, but 9 out of 10. He got destroyed in that 3rd and 4th round. He looked bad to the point where he basically just gave up. Next up, moving on to career, I went 1 out of 10. I think that if anything, this made Roundtree have more status. It made him bigger. It's like, oh, is he the real deal? When Pereira leaves, is he going to be the future champion? So I think it did a lot of great things for his career. The way that he was able to win the 1st and 2nd round, arguably. Yeah. You know, we never saw the scorecards, but was potentially winning those 1st and 2nd rounds. Finally, moving on to embarrassment, I went for a 1 out of 10 again. I think that everyone put a lot of respect on Roundtree's name, even though he got dominated. He won rounds against Pereira. He hung in there for 4 rounds against what could be the best striker in the whole UFC. He did an amazing. So that gives me a total score of 11 out of 30.
All right, that's fair. Let's move on to our very last ranking of the video. We have the iconic Gaethje losing to Holloway, 5th round, last second. Let's get into it. Physically, I went for an 8 out of 10. Gaethje got battered the entire time. He got his nose broken at the end of the 1st round, and then he ended up getting knocked out cold. The only reason I didn't go for maybe a 9 or a 10 is because Gaethje doesn't really show damage, like cuts-wise. He didn't have cuts. He wasn't bleeding a lot other than from his nose, but it could have been higher. I could see a higher number as well. Career-wise, I went for a 9 out of 10. Gaethje literally risked his #1 contender spot for a fight with a featherweight at UFC 300, which fair enough, he's a BMF. I respect it, but it did low-key ruin his chances at a title shot. And now people view him a little bit differently. So I went for a 9 out of 10, how much it affected his career. And then last score, embarrassment, how much were they dominated / viral clips? This was the most viral clip of 2024 in the UFC, so I went for a 10 out of 10, leaving me for a total score, and I believe my highest score of the video, 27 out of 30.
All right. So for our last one, I went 8 out of 10. I think that Gaethje went out there and he got his nose broken and he got pieced up. He doesn't show a ton of damage, but the way he was knocked out, like he was out cold. Like it was like a dead fish. Like he was just...
Yeah.
And then for career, I only went 6 out of 10 just because I think that it kind of diminished his like whole thing where he was a #1 contender, but it was like at the same time, it was like, was he really that good? Like, was he in the same kind of boat as Poirier, where it was kind of like getting up there in age? Like, how many fights does he have left? Let's do these super fights right now, rather than him actually getting a title shot. Because who knows if he did? Who knows if he would have ended up with a title shot? And then finally, for embarrassment, I went 10 out of 10. Everyone's seen that clip. You see that clip every single day, honestly. Like, yeah. I probably see that clip every single day.
Still.
Of him just on the ground. Max pointed to the ground. He got clipped on for a total score of 24 out of 30. And looking at everything, my biggest loss was BSD to Moicano. So that wraps up our list. We're going to put up our list in front of us now. Let us know who you think had the better list. Were we being too nice? Were we being too mean? Let us know what you thought was the biggest loss of the year. And we'll see you guys next time. Peace.
See ya.